At 5:14 over the Baltic Sea, a formation of American F-35s was following its routine patrol route. The morning was quiet until the warning system suddenly lit up. This was not a training scenario. It was not a technical glitch. Across the horizon, nearly 200 blazing red trails appeared at once, cutting through the sky like a storm no one could ignore. There had been no formal announcement, no diplomatic warning, no final message through official channels. Only thick lines of smoke spreading across the dawn, breaking the fragile sense of calm Europe had held onto for 3 decades. The drone encounters, the GPS disruptions, the maritime pressure, the so-called minor incidents discussed on last night's news. By morning, Moscow had turned them into something far bigger. The first domino had fallen, but Moscow was about to learn a lesson with an enormous price. Challenging the United States Navy in international waters is not a show of strength. It is a decision with consequences that cannot be taken back. To understand why the Baltic skies changed so dramatically this morning, we need to look at the uncomfortable truth that many headlines avoid. This crisis did not begin with one random moment. It grew out of what Andrew Liam describes as friction, a dangerous combination of fear, pride, and national interest. First comes fear. Look at the map. With Sweden and Finland now inside NATO, the Baltic Sea has effectively become surrounded by alliance power. Kaliningrad, Russia's forward stronghold, now sits boxed in by Western defense systems on nearly every side. From the Kremlin's perspective, that feels like a direct strategic threat. Their belief is simple. Unless they act early to push back this pressure, they may eventually lose control of their access point to the open sea. So what happened this morning was not random. It was a calculated attempt to move Russia's security line farther away from its own borders. Then comes interest. Russia needs the Suwalki Corridor, the narrow stretch of land connecting Belarus to Kaliningrad, to keep its supply routes open. NATO needs that same corridor to protect the Baltic states. Two sides are focused on the same strategic choke point, and neither can afford to lose influence there. That makes confrontation almost impossible to avoid. Finally, and most dangerously, comes pride. Over the past year, Russia has repeatedly used gray zone pressure, disrupting GPS signals, creating uncertainty for civilian flights, sending drones near sensitive airspace, and shadowing ships in tense waters. Each move tested the same question: would NATO respond, or would it hesitate? But every alliance has a limit. If NATO continues to ignore repeated pressure, Article 5, the promise that allies defend one another, starts to lose meaning. The credibility of the United States and the future strength of the alliance itself are now being judged in real time. This morning, Moscow made what may become its greatest miscalculation in modern history. It believed that a massive opening move would shock the West into hesitation and force negotiations from a position favorable to Russia. It assumed Washington would step back to avoid a wider crisis. But while officials in Brussels were still gathering for emergency talks, just offshore, the SPY-6 radar systems aboard the USS Jack H. Lucas were already tracking the situation with cold precision. The crew did not panic. The systems did not hesitate. They had trained for this kind of moment long before the world believed it could ever return. And now, before we continue, here is a question for every armchair admiral watching. The American Aegis system is legendary. But when nearly 200 incoming targets appear at the same time, even the most advanced defense network faces a true test. So what happens next? Do you believe this steel shield can stop every single incoming threat? Type 1 if you think it can hold completely. Type 2 if you believe probability will have the final say and at least one will break through. Place your bets, because physics does not choose sides. The moment nearly 200 Russian-caliber missiles lifted from their launch platforms, Moscow believed the outcome was already decided. And during the first 10 minutes, the situation looked extremely dangerous for NATO. Ground radar stations along the Baltic frontier were overwhelmed by interference, while warning sirens echoed across Warsaw and Berlin. Russia was relying on a familiar strategy: use massive numbers, strike first, create confusion, and force the opponent into hesitation. But the United States Navy does not depend only on human reaction speed. It fights through a connected combat network. This time, however, that network was pushed harder than ever before. From Kaliningrad, Russia activated some of its most powerful electronic warfare systems, including the Murmansk BN and Krasuka 4. Almost instantly, the SPY-6 radar aboard the USS Jack H. Lucas, often described as one of the most advanced eyes at sea, was flooded with interference. Link 16 communications began to struggle. Russia had tried to turn the Baltic airspace into a room with the lights switched off, and then filled it with incoming threats. Inside the Combat Information Center, the pressure rose fast. Warning calls repeated again and again, but locking onto real targets became difficult as false signals filled the screens. One Onyx missile even pushed through the outer defensive layer, forcing the Phalanx CIWS close-in defense system to respond in the final moments near the American formation. That was the moment everyone understood. This was not an ordinary opponent. And in that chaos, the real strength of the U.S. Navy began to show. The commanding admiral gave an unexpected order. The surface ships were to reduce their own radar emissions. Instead, fire control data would come from above. F-35 Sea Lightning IIs and E-2D Advanced Hawkeye aircraft operating near the edge of the interference zone became the fleet's new eyes. They used optical and infrared sensors, systems that radio jamming cannot easily blind, to detect the heat signatures of Russian missile engines. Then they quietly passed those coordinates down to the destroyers waiting below. That was when the momentum shifted. The U.S. Navy began launching SM-6 interceptors, using targeting data provided almost entirely by the aircraft overhead. Russia believed the American fleet had been blinded. Instead, it watched as its missile wave began disappearing from the sky with alarming precision, taken down by ships that had seemed silent only moments earlier. But Russia had not run out of options. When the air assault began to fall apart, it activated the next phase beneath the surface. Kilo-class submarines, often nicknamed the black holes of the ocean because of their quiet design, began moving into position and launching torpedoes. Now the American ships were being pressured from two directions at once: missiles from above, torpedoes from below. A tense undersea search began immediately. MH-60R. Seahawk helicopters rushed into action, dropping lines of sonobuoys across the water to locate the submarines, while also staying clear of hostile fire. Every second mattered. Every contact on the screen could be the one that decided the next move. By the end of the first hour, the battle had reached a fragile balance. Russia had lost the advantage of surprise, and its attempt to dominate the sky had failed to deliver the result Moscow expected. The main missile wave had been broken, and Russian S-400 air defense batteries were beginning to expose their own positions as they tried to target the F-35s above the Baltic. However, Moscow had shown it still had enough force to put serious pressure on NATO. The first wave had been stopped, but the price was high. A large portion of defensive ammunition had been used, and the entire protection network had been pushed to its breaking point. The Baltic battlefield was now covered in smoke, confusion, and heavy radio interference. Russian commanders began reloading their Bastion coastal launch systems, convinced they had forced NATO into a corner. But that confidence came from looking in the wrong direction. While Moscow kept its focus on the destroyers moving across the surface, far below the cold Baltic waters, the most important piece on the board was already in motion: Virginia-class submarines. During the last hour, while the surface fleet absorbed the pressure, these quiet underwater platforms had been moving carefully through gaps in Russia's anti-submarine coverage. Their mission was not to create noise. Their mission was to disconnect the Baltic fleet from its command structure. Then the order came. From Virginia payload modules, a wave of Tomahawk Block 5 missiles launched from beneath the sea. They did not climb high into the sky where radar could easily spot them. Instead, they stayed low over the water, following the shape of the waves and using the surface itself as cover. Their targets were not frontline troops or armored vehicles. They were the systems that made Russia's battlefield network work: early warning radar sites, command data centers, and most importantly, the Murmansk BN electronic warfare complex in Kaliningrad, the same system that had helped blind NATO sensors earlier. At the same time, far out in the North Atlantic, the U.S. Second Fleet began a much larger strategic move known as the Anaconda Chokehold. Instead of rushing into the dangerous mine-filled waters of the Barents Sea, NATO tightened control around the GI-UK Gap, the crucial ocean passage between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. Poseidon patrol aircraft spread sonobuoys across the water, turning the Atlantic into a vast listening field. Any Russian submarine trying to break through toward the U.S. East Coast would have to cross that invisible barrier. And once detected, it would be tracked immediately. In less than 40 minutes, the entire situation changed. Kaliningrad, once presented as an untouchable fortress, suddenly looked isolated. Its radar coverage was weakened. Its communications were disrupted. Its ability to coordinate with the wider Russian force was badly reduced. Russia still had troops. It still had weapons. But it was losing the one thing modern warfare depends on most: coordination. It was like watching a heavyweight fighter with a blindfold on, throwing punches into empty space while the opponent calmly stepped out of range. Now, as the smoke over the Baltic Sea begins to thin and parts of the Russian fleet drift without clear direction, take a moment and ask yourself, who actually won? If you are imagining US forces marching into Moscow with dramatic music playing in the background, then you are watching the wrong kind of story. In the modern era, especially when great powers are involved, the word victory can be dangerously misleading. Victory is no longer only about flags on captured land or dramatic scenes on a map. For NATO and the United States, victory in this moment is measured by what was preserved. Did we protect the territory of our member states? Yes. Did we uphold the promise of Article 5 and prevent the alliance from breaking under pressure? Yes. And most importantly, did we get through this battle without seeing the ultimate nightmare unfold over Berlin, Washington, or any other city? Yes. That is what strategic victory looks like. But what about Russia? Do not be too quick to laugh. From Moscow's point of view, they do not need to occupy Paris or London to claim success. Their objective is much colder, simpler, and more pragmatic: the survival of the regime. If they can force the West into a painful stalemate, if they can damage Europe's economy badly enough to drag NATO to the negotiating table, and if they can make the world accept their new security perimeter, then in the Kremlin's mind, they have already achieved what they wanted. They do not need a clean win. They only need to make the cost of challenging them so high that no one wants to try again. So what is the final conclusion? Andrew Liam calls this a coercive stalemate. On the military chessboard, the US Navy has trapped the Russian fleet. But on the geopolitical chessboard, there is no true winner. Both sides walk away damaged. The global economy is shaken, the international order is thrown into uncertainty, and the belief that peace in Europe was permanent is gone. There are no winners here, only survivors, and some lose more than others. We are standing at a crossroads where history can move in two very different directions. And honestly, neither path looks like a happy ending. Behind the first door is the hot Cold War scenario. The fighting stops, but the global economy suffers a major shock. Supply chains begin to break, prices climb, energy markets panic, and suddenly military success feels very small if your savings are disappearing and fuel costs are rising out of control. The world would be divided by a new Iron Curtain, colder, harder, and more unstable than the one before it. But behind the second door is the real nightmare. That is the moment Moscow decides the humiliation is too great to accept and reaches for its most dangerous escalation doctrine. Imagine one side, cornered and desperate, placing an irreversible threat on the negotiating table simply to prove it still has the will to go further. They might choose a limited demonstration at sea, not to win the battle, but to send one message: we are willing to cross lines, others will not. If that happens, every rule humanity has tried to preserve since 1945 begins to crack. In this kind of conflict, Andrew Liam's warning becomes painfully clear. No one truly wins. Some simply survive the consequences. But now, pause for a moment. Take a breath. Look out the window. The sun is still shining, the sky is quiet, and there are no warning trails crossing above your city. Everything you have just watched, from Russia's opening strike to America's overwhelming response, is hypothetical. It is a strategic scenario based on Professor Andrew Liam's article, The NATO-Russia War of 2025, published in the National Security Journal. So why tell this story? Not to spread fear, but to remind us of a lesson history keeps teaching and humanity keeps forgetting. Deterrence only works when it is believable. The power of the US Navy, its aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, aircraft, and global command network was not built simply to start conflicts. It exists to prevent the worst-case scenario from ever becoming reality. We sharpen the sword every day so that it never has to leave its sheath. That is the price of peace. Now the question is yours. Is America's deterrent strong enough to keep that second door permanently closed? Or are we drifting into a new century of instability without realizing how close the edge really is? Leave your thoughts below, and if this video gave you a tactical perspective that most headlines ignore, support the channel with a like and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. For now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.